For years, the war in Europe had become a nightmare without an end. Entire nations were locked in mud-filled trenches, soldiers living and dying just meters apart, artillery shaking the earth day and night. Empires like Germany, Austria-Hungary, Britain, and France believed they understood the rhythm of this war. They believed nothing could truly surprise them anymore. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched. A young industrial power, distant from the blood-soaked fields of Europe, confident in its oceans for protection. Many European commanders dismissed America entirely. Some called it naive. Others believed its army was too small, too inexperienced, too untested to matter. To them, the United States was an economic supplier, not a decisive force. But war has a way of punishing arrogance. By 1917, Europe was exhausted. Millions were dead, morale was crumbling, and entire generations were being erased in the trenches. Germany believed time was on its side. Britain and France were barely holding on. And still, few believed that the arrival of American soldiers could change anything. After all, how could a nation with no recent experience in modern warfare alter a conflict that had consumed the world for 3 relentless years? Then came the decision. When the United States entered the war, it was not a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration that the balance of the world itself was about to shift. Factories that once fueled civilian growth transformed into engines of war. Railroads stretched endlessly across the continent. Shipyards worked without pause. America did not prepare slowly. It mobilized with a speed the world had never seen before. And while European armies were shrinking, the American army was growing, day by day, month by month. Hundreds of thousands of fresh soldiers crossed the ocean, not broken by years in the trenches, not haunted by endless stalemates. They arrived with energy, confidence, and an unshaken belief that victory was still possible. For the first time in years, the Allies saw something they had almost forgotten: momentum. German intelligence reports began to change tone. What had once been dismissed as irrelevant now demanded attention. American troops were disciplined, organized, and frighteningly fast to adapt. They learned the realities of trench warfare not in years, but in months. And behind every soldier stood the full industrial power of a nation untouched by destruction. This was no longer just about numbers. It was psychological. The presence of American forces sent a message through the trenches, whispered among exhausted soldiers, echoed in command rooms. The war was no longer a slow death by attrition. Something new had entered the battlefield. Something unpredictable. Something relentless. And the enemies of the United States were about to discover a truth they never anticipated. America had not come to observe the war. America had come to end it. When American troops finally reached the front lines, the war changed its rhythm. European soldiers noticed it immediately. These men did not carry the look of those who had survived years in the trenches. They marched with purpose, with posture, with an intensity that felt unfamiliar on a battlefield shaped by despair. The American expeditionary forces were not perfect. They made mistakes. They learned under fire. But what shocked both allies and enemies was how quickly they adapted. Trench warfare, artillery coordination, machine gun tactics. In months, American units absorbed lessons that had taken others years of suffering to understand. and once they learned, they pushed forward. German commanders began to realize the danger too late. Reports spoke of American assaults that did not stall, of soldiers advancing where others hesitated, of attacks carried out with relentless pressure rather than cautious waiting. The battlefield had grown louder, faster, more aggressive. But the true power of the United States was not only in its soldiers, it was behind them. An endless flow of supplies crossed the Atlantic: weapons, ammunition, vehicles, food, fuel. While European factories struggled under bombardment and exhaustion, American industry operated at full force, untouched, unstoppable. The Allies were no longer counting shells, no longer rationing hope. They finally had abundance. Morale shifted in ways that could not be measured on maps. French and British troops who had fought since the beginning of the war saw something they had nearly lost: belief. They were no longer standing alone against a seemingly endless enemy. They were advancing with a nation that brought not just men, but certainty. For Germany, the realization was devastating. Every month, more American soldiers arrived, fresh, trained, determined. The numbers grew faster than German losses could be replaced. The war of attrition that Germany believed it could win was turning against it, not slowly, but decisively. Then came the offensives. Battles like Cantigny, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive revealed the full impact of American involvement. These were not symbolic actions. They were massive operations, coordinated, sustained, and relentless. German lines cracked, defenses collapsed, retreats followed. For the first time, the enemy understood something terrifying. This war was no longer about endurance. It was about inevitability. The United States had brought fresh strength into a dying conflict, and that strength did not fade. It multiplied. As weeks passed, German soldiers whispered among themselves, not about if the war would end, but when. And increasingly, the answer pointed in only one direction. The world was witnessing the arrival of a new power, one that had entered the war late, but would leave it remembered forever. And the greatest shock of all was that America had only just begun to show what it was capable of. As the final months of the war approached, the balance had completely shifted. What once felt like an endless stalemate had become a countdown. German cities were strained, supply lines fractured, morale eroded, and on the battlefield, the pressure never stopped. American forces did not slow down. They advanced through forests soaked in rain and smoke, through shattered villages and ruined fields. Each step forward carried a message the enemy could no longer ignore. There would be no relief, no pause, no second chance. The Meuse-Argonne offensive became the clearest symbol of this new reality. Over 1 million American soldiers moved with determination through one of the most brutal terrains of the war. Losses were heavy, resistance was fierce. But unlike earlier years, exhaustion no longer decided the outcome. Momentum did. German commanders faced an impossible equation. Every retreat weakened their position. Every delay allowed more American troops to arrive. The front lines stretched thin. Reserves vanished. And the question haunting Berlin was no longer how to win, but how to survive the end. Then, the silence began to spread. Entire units surrendered. Trenches were abandoned. Orders lost meaning. Soldiers who had once believed victory was inevitable now looked across the battlefield and saw something far more frightening than defeat. They saw certainty. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed, and the world stepped out of the shadow of the First Global War. For the United States, the cost had been high, lives lost, wounds carried forever, but the impact was undeniable. America had entered the war late, yet reshaped its conclusion, no longer seen as a distant observer, no longer underestimated. The United States emerged as a decisive force, a nation capable of changing the fate of continents. Its industrial power, military resolve, and unyielding momentum had altered history. And as the world looked toward an uncertain future, one truth remained clear. When America finally stepped onto the battlefield, the war's ending became inevitable, and the echoes of that realization would shape the entire century that followed.